Detroit Homecoming has been made possible by Urban Science, guiding business through science. Make decisions by what you know, not what you think. And by the William K. Kellogg Foundation, working with communities to create conditions for vulnerable children so they can realize their full potential in school, work, and life.
So for our next element of this, I'm really honored to have this piece. We're going to be bringing Steve Case to the stage. So he's been a household name since the mid-'80s when he founded
Hello, everybody.
AOL. And what more can you do, right? You bring the modern internet to people. Over 50% of the country are subscribers. And then you create this incredible, the largest merger ever with Time Warner. What else do you do? Well, I guess you create a revolution after that. And that's what Steve did. After he exited from AOL, he created Revolution, an investment fund, a series of investment funds that he'll talk about. And from our standpoint, this may be even more important than Steve's first act, in that he's focusing on shining a light on entrepreneurs in the non-obvious places, not in Silicon Valley, not in Boston, and not in New York. And then 5 years ago, he formed the Rise of the Rest, which you could call a fund. It's really a movement, and it's a philosophy about the notion that opportunity is not equally dispersed, even though talent is equally dispersed. And when Steve started Rise of the Rest, which we'll talk about 5 years ago, right at the beginning, he came to Detroit to look at it. And many of us were in that Rise of the Rest event that was put on here in Detroit. So I'm just really proud to have you here today and pleased to be able to talk to you. So, Steve, if you could talk about what is Revolution, and it has many parts, I know, and so I'd love to have you sort of describe it to the audience.
Well, first of all, it's great to be back. I've actually come to Detroit probably twice a year for the last 5 years. So and I'm not from Detroit. I didn't grow up here. I didn't go to school here. So it's just I love what's happening. I love the momentum. And Revolution now has 6 investments in Detroit and 9 in Michigan. And some are kind of bigger, kind of well-known companies like Shinola. More recently, StockX, quite recently, as you know, Bloomscape, you just heard from Justin. And it's a perfect example of what we're trying to see, which are cities that were strong at one point, lost some of their energy, entrepreneurial mojo, people, et cetera, and are now kind of fighting their way back and are launching the next generation of great companies, not just in Silicon Valley, New York City, Boston, but all over the country, and what's happening here in Detroit is a great example of that. In terms of your question, Revolution is really trying to back these entrepreneurs, irrespective of what stage they are. So we have a seed fund, the Rise of the Rest fund. We have Revolution Ventures. We announced yesterday a new $215 million fund, and Renaissance is an investor in that, which is great. Kind of further strengthens the connection with Michigan. And then we have Revolution Growth making kind of later stage investments. And most of the seed investments tend to be $500,000 or so. Most of the venture investments tend to be $5 million or so. Most of the growth investments tend to be $20, $30 million or so. So whether it's the earliest stage on the seed side, where we partner with regional venture firms, we partner now and co-invested with over 200 firms. Seed funds made 130 investments in 70 cities, 32 states. Or on the venture side, where we play a more active role in terms of actually participating in the boards, things like that, where we've also made investments. So it's a way to generate returns for our investors. And one of the points we make is there's a great arbitrage right out there right now, where valuations, I think, in Silicon Valley are a little high. There's so much capital there chasing. They're great entrepreneurs building great companies, but everybody is trying to get into those deals, and valuations tend to get bid up. As you talk to entrepreneurs here, including folks in the audience, the sense is the valuations in Detroit or other parts of Michigan, other parts of the country tend to be more modest, which is a frustration to the entrepreneurs, but a great opportunity for the investors. So that's part of it. But in the process, we're also trying to do what we can to help these cities rise and create more momentum and have thriving startup communities. And in the process of that, try to level the playing field. So everybody everywhere really does have a shot at the American dream. And right now, if you just look at the data, that's not true. And the 3 data points I just, most of you probably know this, but for those who don't, last year, 75% of venture capital, 7-5, went to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts, 75%. The other 47 states fight over 25%. Michigan got less than 1%. Not just Detroit, but Ann Arbor and Traverse City, all parts of Michigan, less than 1%. Ohio, less than 1%. Pennsylvania, less than 1%. Virginia, less than 1%. Florida, 3rd largest state, 1.3%. Texas, Austin, Dallas, Houston, everything's bigger in Texas. It's a little bit bigger, 2%. California alone, 50%. So you're advantaged if you're an entrepreneur in California. Last night, I saw an entrepreneur who started here, ended up moving to California, and just closed a $50 million round because he didn't think he could do it here, which is a big missed opportunity for Detroit. That's one data point. The second data point is last year, more than 90% of venture capital went to men, less than 10% to women. And last year, less than 1% went to African Americans. So if you just look at the data, this is a great country. It's a great entrepreneurial nation, arguably the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world. But it does matter where you live. It does matter what you look like. Kind of does matter who you know. Or if you have an idea, you can really turn into a great company. The next Facebook or StockX or Bloomscape or what have you. And that's not right, and that's not fair, and that's not smart. So we're just trying to do what we can, the prism of getting investors on the coast to pay more attention to what's happening here. And I'd encourage those who are investors to really, you have some connection with Detroit. That's why you're back. That's great. You probably feel a sense of vibrancy, the momentum that maybe wasn't, there last time you were here. That's great. But do something. Not just because you have some connection to it, but because they're great investment opportunities. StockX, we invested in the seed round. It was a $12 million valuation. The last round was over $1 billion valuation. That was one of our best investments. It wasn't done as some charity project for Detroit. It was like an awesome idea, awesome entrepreneur, and we're making a lot of money. And so it's time for people to believe in cities like Detroit and invest in cities like Detroit, not just because it's the right thing to do, but as I said before, it's also the smart thing to do from an investment standpoint, capitalizing on this arbitrage.
Well, I want to riff on something you just talked about. So I look at a lot of funds, and I saw, and I won't name the company, a company was recently sold for $1 billion, and I looked at their investors, and most of the investors made 2 to 3 times their money back on $1 billion exit. That's a much different math formula than what you have in the regions that you're looking at.
Yeah, no, it obviously depends on what stage you invest, and whether that's with seed and venture and growth, evaluations obviously are going up as the companies mature, and so that some of that goes with the territory. When you're an investor looking at it, you just have to believe from that point there's still a significant opportunity for upside potential beyond that. But there's no question this arbitrage still exists, and it probably will exist for 5, maybe even 10 years. Eventually it closes. Eventually the markets will be more efficient. And even if you look at those sectors, the markets already are pretty efficient, not perfectly efficient, but pretty efficient at the growth stage. Mm-hmm. If you're raising $25 million or $50 million, people actually will get on planes from California or New York to come to Michigan, and StockX is certainly a recent example. Duo Security is another example in Ann Arbor. The market is not efficient at the venture stage, and it's certainly not efficient at the seed stage. So over time, as the companies mature and the checks get larger, getting more investor attention it gets easier. It's never easy, but it gets easier. But that early stage, when you're just getting going, is quite difficult.
So you'd had Revolution Growth and Revolution Ventures for a while, and then 5 years ago, you formed Rise of the Rest. Can you talk about the thought that went into that and the reason for that?
Well, I had been asked 9 or 10 years ago to co-chair something in Washington, D.C. called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It was kind of part of the Commerce Department. And that led to a series of recommendations to the White House, then President Obama, including one that essentially resulted in the White House creating an initiative called Startup America, which I was asked to chair. And we spent a lot of time traveling around the country trying to kind of talk about this issue and get people's attention. And there's some policy things that happened. Passed a legislation called the Jobs Act, jumpstarting our business startups, and some other things happened there. That led to about 5 years ago saying, let's hit the ground, and instead of just talking about it, let's show it and prove it. This thesis around, kind of entrepreneurship and what can happen in this next kind of wave of innovation. And as you said in the intro, the first stop of our first Rise the Rest, bus tour was Detroit 5 years ago with Dan Gilbert and the mayor and the governor, and it was got things going. And since then, now we've done 8 of these road trips, visited 43 cities, I think, and it's remarkable what's happening everywhere. But it's particularly remarkable what's happening here in Detroit. Obviously, it's a lot of people participating. I mentioned some of the government leadership, the Kresge Foundation, and others have done a lot of great things. But I also should say, partly because he's not here, and he's a great friend and a partner with us on a number of investments, including Rise Rest. Dan Gilbert has been the catalyst in the last decade that has really taken kind of Detroit on, and I'm sure you see this locally for those of you who are here, but I see it as we travel around the country how dogged he's been in getting people to pay attention. The reason the Business Council met here last fall was because of Dan Gilbert. The reason Forbes 30 Under 30 will be here next month is because of Dan Gilbert. So that leadership, somebody saying, this is a great opportunity and it's a great investment in terms of the upside, but also I'm going to figure out a way to galvanize all factions to really believe in Detroit again and prove that the best days were not 100 years ago when it was around cars. And I remind people I travel around the country that partly because Detroit was the first city we visited, and most of you know this story, but not everybody in the country does, that in many ways 100 years ago Detroit was Silicon Valley. It was the most innovative city in the country. The car wasn't like the internet revolution, it was the car revolution. Everybody wanted to be part of the car revolution, and Detroit was the place to be. So people moved here, and houses were built, and roads were built, and schools were being built, and it was rocking and rolling until it kind of hit some bumps in the road. And as we all know, lost 60% of its population in 50 years. They went bankrupt, and it was Silicon Valley. And a lot of people 5 years ago thought, well, Detroit had its run. Bummer. Some people, like Dan, but others in this room, I applaud Mary and the team at Cranes for even the idea of Detroit Homecoming and some of the other things that have been put in place, said, no. We have a glorious history. We've had some problems, but we have a bright future. And we're going to win the battle for attention, we're going to win the battle for capital, and then we're going to win the battle for talent. And that's what Rise the Rest is all about. How do you kind of get the sense that entrepreneurship is not just about a few people in a few places, but it really is about everybody everywhere, and how do you create a more inclusive innovation economy so more people in more places feel like they have a bright future, not that sort of they're kind of in a difficult situation and it's probably going to get worse.
So you started in Detroit. You've been to 43 cities, you said. I've been to 2 of them with when you were there, and it was sort of part evangelization and part listening tour. Mm-hmm. So what have you learned over the course of those trips to 43 cities, and what's happened since then?
Well, what we learned is what we suspected, that there are great entrepreneurs there, but it's harder in certain places for those entrepreneurs to get started, harder even for them to scale. And it's gotten a little bit better, but still really hard. So we're super optimistic about what's happening. We're super confident that these cities will rise. The next wave of entrepreneurs, some of the breakout companies will be not just on the coast, but in the middle of the country, places like Detroit. But we also are eyes wide open. There's still a lot of challenges. And we published a lot of work on this, and on the Rise the Rest site you can look at. We published something called the Entrepreneurship Playbook that identifies different things we've seen in different cities, lessons learned, best practices, things like that. But I'd focus on 3 in particular. One is just belief, and it's like an attitude, like a cultural attitude, like we can do this, we got this. Most places we visit do not have that optimistic attitude. They do not believe that entrepreneurs can build great companies there, and that when they hear a pitch from an entrepreneur, they tend to focus on what might go wrong as opposed to what might go right. Changing that attitude, and that is probably the most remarkable thing that's happened in Detroit in the last 5 years. It's sort of obviously still a lot of challenges, but maybe we can do this. Like StockX, maybe we are capable of launching the next generation companies. That it's kind of cultural attitude point is super important. Capital obviously is important for the reasons I mentioned. It's just some people are able to bootstrap their companies to significance, but the vast majority of the fast-growing companies that create lots of jobs do raise venture capital. If the only venture capital goes to a few people in a few places, that's a problem. So you need to have more organizations like Renaissance investing kind of regionally. You need to help launch and scale the next wave of regional venture firms, and you need to educate people on the coast that here's why it makes sense, it's worth your while to get on a plane because there are great opportunities there to generate great investment returns. So capital is certainly important. And the third is talent. The reality is, and Homecoming is a perfect example of that, presumably you're homecoming because at one point this was your home. But you left. And you left because you felt the opportunity was better elsewhere. And you were right. But that brain drain has hollowed out the innovation economy in most parts of the country. So how do you slow that brain drain? How do people growing up in Detroit or graduate from schools in Michigan stay here? Because the opportunity here is better as opposed to leave here and go someplace else. And how do you actually create a boomerang of talent where people who did leave, including some people in this room, say, you know what, now's the time to come back. Now's the time to come home. Not because I want to come home for family reasons or lifestyle reasons, although some people might, but because actually I can be more successful here if I'm part of StockX or part of Bloomscape or some of the companies, Justin said part of their challenge is hiring the people to scale the companies. The expertise in scaling those companies exists in other places. Some of the people who were in this place but left, now it's time to consider coming back. So if you can figure out ways to continue to build on the cultural attitude, we can do this, optimism, kind of side of things. You can continue to fight the battle both regionally and nationally for capital, and you can figure out how to win on the talent side. So fewer people leave and more people return. This what is now already a thriving startup community will surprise everybody over the next decade.
So you started Rise of the Rest here in Detroit, and we talked a little bit about it. Why did you pick Detroit?
Well, it goes back to what I said before. We kind of knew the backstory. Certainly Detroit was like a storied American city with this glorious history, as I mentioned, around cars and what was happening 7,500 years ago. And we also knew, obviously the story about, the decline and some of the challenges. But it just seemed like a great place to kick off what, as you say, was kind of a movement to create a new generation of entrepreneurship, a new wave of entrepreneurship that was spread more broadly. So Detroit, as mentioned, was the first city. We also went to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh powered the Industrial Revolution. It was, while Detroit was building cars, Pittsburgh was building steel and essentially built, most of the cities around the country. And then Carnegie Mellon, because of what they're doing with robotics, was doing some interesting things. So we picked some cities deliberately that were iconic cities that really were critical in that Industrial Revolution, but had kind of lost their way in some respects, and we're showing a sign of turning the corner and a sign of momentum. We thought it was a good way to maybe try to champion things in Detroit or Pittsburgh or these other cities for the entrepreneurs in those cities, but also kind of get more attention from folks in other places, whether they had megaphones like the media or checkbooks like the investors, to say you should take another look at Detroit.
And that led to, you've done a number of investments, as you talked about, and then this summer came Bloomscape. And I think I could safely speak for Justin here when I would say, he talked to a lot of investors, particularly on the coasts, who just didn't get it. And you guys got it and got it really quickly. Can you talk a little bit about that story?
Absolutely. And we've seen this in different cities. We always go in with a thesis, as you'd expect, that a city like Detroit, because of its history, mobility would be obvious, or a city like St. Louis or Lincoln, because of farming, ag tech would be an obvious sector, or Cleveland or Baltimore, kind of health IT, health tech would be obvious. But we also have seen time and time again, you need broader peripheral vision, and you can't just look at the obvious things. And as I said, StockX is a perfect example. There's no particular reason that company would be in Detroit. People would think it would be someplace else. And we felt the same way about Bloomscape. So our team does spend a lot of time traveling the country and meeting entrepreneurs. And our Revolution Ventures team, particularly Clara, who kind of led this investment, had spent time talking to Justin and understanding what they were trying to do. And then obviously when Renaissance creates their list of kind of the hot companies to watch, which we do encourage people in different places to do because it helps curate the deal flow for investors, which happened a few months ago, that kind of can increase our conviction now is time to invest. And it's a perfect example of a company that is showing great momentum, a history of his family being in that business for decades and decades and decades, and even his mom being like the ambassador, the plant mom. The history there, I think, was interesting, and what they're doing around e-commerce, and particularly their focus on millennials and the growth rate was interesting. It's gone from a few people now to a couple dozen people. It's going to be a few hundred people over the next few years. But the challenge is making sure you have the people, not just the capital, which they now have, but the people to scale. So, as Justin said when he was talking, if you're in some other place and you're looking for an opportunity to come back, that is an example of a company that is definitely on the rise and going to be a significant company 5 years from now.
Great. So what can we learn from the other cities that you visited? You've seen a lot of cities take different approaches. What are some things you think we could learn from that?
Well, I think you're doing a pretty darn good job, and I really do. And it's sort of the reason why I've come back, probably 10 times in the last 5 years, and the reason we've made, as I said, kind of 9 investments in Michigan, 6 in Detroit alone, is we see what's happening. We see the momentum. I remember when I came, probably even before our Rise Restaurant, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, for a meeting. I was staying at I think it just opened, the Book Cadillac Hotel. I was going out in the morning to kind of jog, and somebody said, "Don't go that way." It was like kind of dangerous. Like, oh, okay. And back then, some parts of some parts of downtown were dangerous. Nobody says that now. I'm sure, obviously, every city has challenges and crime, homelessness, other kinds of things. But what's happened in a relatively short period of time, a downtown that was basically hollowed out and dead is now vibrant and thriving. There are companies, not just some iconic big ones like a Quicken Loans, but new ones like a Shinola or StockX or more recently Bloomscape are on the move. They are on the rise. So I think it goes back to these points. I think more people do believe. I'm sure there's some folks here here, but came with like skepticism, like we'll see, but I don't know. So more people are starting to believe, more capital is beginning to come in when companies like Google start investing in, like with StockX here, usually leads over time to other investments, just as the case with Revolution, going from 0 investments to 9 investments in 5 years. But this talent piece is the one to focus on. How do you, as I said before, how do you create an environment with enough vitality around the startup community, enough breakout successes that younger people now do not feel like they have to leave, and people who left feel like it's time to come back. Detroit, of the different cities we visited, things have really rock and rolling. Obviously, Dan gets a lot of credit for that, but other people in this, including a lot of people in this room, get credit as well. But I just urge people to feel like, okay, we should feel really good about the progress we've made in the last 5 years. Like, good for us. But it's like the second inning, maybe the bottom of the first inning. There's a lot of work to be done to continue to build on that success and have that glorious history of Detroit. More about the future and less about the past. It's also, I think, a good reminder to all of us that America itself was a startup. It was just an idea, and actually a pretty fragile idea that, like most startups, almost failed several times. The country almost hit the wall. And now it's the leader of the free world, it has a leading economy. And that wasn't an accident. That was the work of entrepreneurs. They built these cities. And America led the way in the agricultural revolution 200 years ago, led the way in the Industrial Revolution 100 years ago, more recently led the way in the technology revolution, in the digital revolution. That's why it went from this fragile startup nation to kind of the leader of the pack. So the question is, what's the next wave going to be? And it's game on. Other countries have figured out that entrepreneurship is sort of the secret sauce that made America America, and they're trying to build their own thriving startup communities and invest in R&D, and things have really accelerated in the last couple of decades. We are at risk of losing our edge as the most innovative nation. The only way, in my opinion, to hedge that is to broaden our focus around innovation entrepreneurship, and instead of just focusing Silicon Valley. Again, I love Silicon Valley, I love New York City, I love Boston, great things happening there, but not all great entrepreneurs are there, and so not all the capital should be invested there, and we need to have a more kind of evenly dispersed innovation economy, have more shots on goal in more parts of the country, some of which will not just create the companies of the future, but the industries of the future. And if we do that, then I think America will continue to be in the lead. If we don't do that, we just do more of the same, we're gonna lose our lead and lose our way, just as Detroit did, 100 years ago booming, 50 years ago struggling, and now kind of trying to fight its way back. Let's don't lose that and have to go bankrupt in order to have the opportunity to fight our way back. Let's keep fighting.
At the risk of embarrassing Mary, how does something like homecoming fit into this?
Perfect. No, as I said, when we first started talking about this several years ago, I knew it was a brilliant idea, and I do spend most of my time traveling around. Last week I was in Minneapolis and Tulsa and Oklahoma City, met with Oklahoma City with the governor, lieutenant governor, probably 25 business leaders, and pitched them on doing homecoming. I said, you should look at what Detroit's doing. The program is extraordinary. They're able to get several hundred people to come back, and obviously some people just have a good time and go home and forget about it. But some people will say, something's happening there, and I want to be part of it. And whether that is moving back, or that is investing, or that is mentoring, or that is whatever, doing something, that's the beginning of how you change this dynamic around talent, change this dynamic around capital, and change this dynamic around kind of creating that kind of a can-do attitude. So I think this is brilliant. I think every Rise of the Rest city should be doing a homecoming, and hats off to Mary and the whole team at Cranes for taking that idea and scaling it, and thanks to everybody in the audience for showing up. Hopefully you won't just go to the fun speakeasies. You'll actually say, I can do something here, and I want to do something here, and I should do something here, and do something. Like I said at the beginning, I have no connection to Detroit. I made 6 investments. What are you going to do? Come on, step up.
And I'll finish with, I want to give you a second to talk about the news that you announced yesterday, which is not only good news for you, but it's good news for everybody who shares the thesis that you have.
We talked briefly about it before. I mentioned that Revolution has the Rise of the Rest Seed Fund, which is all iconic individual investors: Dan Gilbert, Jeff Bezos, Eric Schmidt, Tory Blakely, Sarah Blakely, Tory Burch. People like that are individuals or investors in the seed fund. And then for Revolution Ventures and Revolution Growth, it's really institutional investors. We announced yesterday a new Revolution Ventures $215 million fund explicitly focused on investing in these rising cities like Detroit. And Revolution Ventures is the part of our firm that invested in Bloomscape. Revolution Growth invested in Chinola and a handful of the companies, including StockX and GuardHat and others. We invested the Rise of the Rest Seed Fund. So we're trying to get more capital focused on places like Detroit, and we're looking for entrepreneurs to back and help tell, not just provide some of the capital to fund them, but help them build their companies and help them tell their story around the country, indeed around the world.
Great, and it's great news for us. Thank you so much
for
being with us today.
Enjoy the week.